Optical tactile sensing with a human touch. So this title is basically because I'm very lucky to be with Casper and Vincent in this session. So I tried to think of a title that would kind of encompass all of our work. So Casper, I think, is going to talk about our vision-based forced tactile sensing for medical applications. Vincent, mechanics of touch, human touch. And then my work is on optical tactile, biometric optical tactile sensing. So I think it kind of fits us all. Okay, so what do we do in our group in BRL? So we build 3D printed robots with a sense of touch, optical tactile sensing, sense of touch. We use AI now. We've increasingly started using deep learning over the last year or two. And then we try to make these robots biometric, so they mimic the human sense of touch and take inspiration from it. So here's the recent work that I'm going to cover today. I'm going to cover the miniaturization integration of optical tactile sensing technology that we use, Tactile, into robot hands. There's a few papers submitted on that. Optimal deep learning for robust pose estimation, that is published in the RAM special issue in deep learning robotics. I'll cover that, it's just out. And then some work on tactile servoing control, related to Robert Hashke's work that he was discussing earlier. So that abrupt interface, that's a recent BBC documentary that has explained far better than I how our sensor works, because there's a professional presenter talking about it. That's up on BBC iPlayer. There's about a 5-minute section. I didn't want to put too much more of it because of copyright and things like that. But please have a look at that, and it puts it in very kind of nice terms about how our sensor works. So we shot another video in our lab because we can't really use that material. So I'll use that to explain some background.
So our artificial fingertip is designed to mimic how our actual skin works on our fingertips. The key principle for how the human sense of touch works is there are these little bumps underneath the outer layer of skin, and we feel contact through the movement of those bumps. A core technology for our research is a 3D printed biometric artificial tactile sensor that we call the Tactile. So in our artificial tactile sensor, we 3D print analogous bumps underneath the artificial skin. So rather than in human skin where nerve cells pick up that motion of the bumps, we use a camera inside the tactile sensor. We use a camera within the sensor because it's cheap, readily available technology.
So here's another so here's a verbal description. So we say it's a biometric tactile sensor, 3D printed, optical, uses a camera to view the inside of the sensor. So we use these little kind of bumps, these nodules on the inside of the skin, and they have markers at the end that are picked up with the optical tactile sensing. And we consider that to be biometric because there's an analogous structure under our skin between the dermis and the epidermis, which is how our skin transduces deformation of the skin surface into nerve signals. So we would see ourselves as fitting between optical tactile sensing, like the gel site and Casper's technology, and also biometrics in that the sensor works analogously to the human sense of touch. Okay, so because it's 3D printed, we've kind of proliferated a family of designs because we can rapidly turn around new kind of prototypes and new designs. So this was about the state of the art, say, sort of 5 years ago. And then we've this is the one we kind of use routinely now, the Tactile. And then we've got various different shapes and sizes for integration into robot hands. So this is up to a couple of years ago. We worked from 1 tactile fingertip to 2. It was also using 3D printed robot hands as well, such as the Model O and the GR2 from the Grab Lab, because they've openly distributed the designs for how to 3D print the hands. So it fits well with our technology, which is 3D printed as well. So that's up to a couple of years back. So then we're moving forward for 3-fingered robot hands. Couple of these we're working on or worked on. So there's the one that's published, the others are still in submission, about a year and a half. This is the Model O 3-fingered robot hand from the Grab Lab. This was the one that won the DARPA Grand Challenge like about 7 years ago now, seems quite a long time ago. So we've integrated our tactile sensor into that. A couple of years ago, we did this actually now, year and a half ago. And then the other hand, so this has got four motors on this one. And then there's a shadow modular grasper, which is a fully articulated 8 degrees of freedom, 8 motors, I think, robot hand, but fully actuated. But we've also integrated the sensors into. It's a huge hand, so actually these tactile sensors, these tack tips on the tip aren't much smaller than the ones we use as single ones on the end of a robot arm. So here's some examples, the kind of things we do with it. Using AI, using deep learning on the left, and actually a more kind of a different AI method on the right. But it's kind of things like, you know, the Model A is very good at picking up objects. Basically, just picks, give it something, it'll pick it up. And so here we're using the tactile sensing, first of all, to classify the type of object under unknown pose of the object. So if you pick it up in a different way, it can still classify it as the same object. And then also grasp success prediction, so that you know before you pick the object up if that grasp is going to be successful. And so in principle, you could then re-grasp it if you know it's not going to work. So then we're up about 90% on that, on 30 objects, about 1,000 grasps, using fairly standard like convolutional neural network approaches applied to the tactile images. And then the paper here was more about the integration, but then we showed that you could use that tactile information, because it's a fully actuated hand, to reposition the orientation of the fingertips on the object to give it a more stable grasp, basically to make the fingertips normal to the object. So here's some more stuff with the Model O. So this is on in-hand slip detection, again for grasp stabilization. So if your grasp fails, you want to detect rapidly that it has failed and try to, you know, re-grasp that object. And it turns out the tack tip design is very effective at slip perception, because it measures shear, and shear in the shear signal is a clear signal for slip. And this differs from, say, more sort of normal tactile-based tactile sensors, which generally just measure the normal force, and so don't give a lot of information about slip. If you like, the tack tip is super sensitive to slip, and that allows us to do these kind of demonstrations where it you know, rapidly re-grasps the object if it slips. And then it can also detect very light forces, as you've seen here with this another clip from the BBC video where it's picking up this kind of origami crane, which it will now drop onto the bottom. Yeah, right, good. So where are we going? So as I think was in the chat, the way the field is moving is miniaturizing these optical tactile sensors down, making use of advances in camera technology, such as from smartphones, which are making the cameras incredibly small. You can get cameras like a few millimeters in size now, with, like, you know, high definition, so on. So there's been several groups who are doing this. Shan's work, as he just mentioned, Roberto Calandra is going to mention it. It's at Facebook now, but from Sergey Levine's group. You know, Ted Adelson, they're doing this as well. And they're all with the gel site, you know, and this is, if you like, our version of it without sensor, with the tack tip. That's hopefully will be accepted at IROS soon. So as you can see, so what we've done is we've integrated it with the PISA IIT soft hand. So this is an anthropomorphic robot hand that's also biometric. It uses this principle of operation is that it has these grasp primitives, but it's extracted from how the the dynamics of the human hand, the mechanics of the human hand. So it takes those principal components and, if you like, embodies them in the design of the robot hand, of an anthropomorphic robot hand. And then we have a biometric tactile sensor, so we've integrated that technology into this hand. And as I say, we've got a kind of what we would see as a pleasing design that kind of fits naturally within the shape of the hand. Say relies on having a very small camera inside it that we're hopefully going to take forward. And so this is an example of the kind of thing. I mean, we haven't done many kind of in-hand manipulation tests and so forth yet, although that is the plan. partly because the laboratory is closed, but this is kind of where we got to. And this is just showing that you can kind of do accurate perception with this sensor on the hand. So this is a typical binarized tactile image you get from it. This is an edge orientation task. We just pushed different edges onto the fingertip and just checked we could perceive the if you like, the orientation and the depth and the position on the fingertip accurately, and we can, we're at kind of sub-millimeter position localization, depth down to like 200 microns, at the angle about 10 degrees, once you've got a perception system on the hand, then you can use that perception system for control. So that's the aim of this. Okay, so I'll change gear now to talk about optimal deep learning for pose estimation. So that relates to this because this is an example of pose estimation of an edge. Yeah, but I'll talk about how we're doing that, and I emphasize this paper was published in the special issue of Deep Learning Robotics, so it's all online now. Okay, so this is what the purpose of this for, is to do stuff like this, where you've got, you want the fingertip to interact in real time with a complex object in 3 dimensions, in a way that the humans, you could imagine a human doing this sort of task. And in fact, we do it routinely, brushing our hair or something. We do this kind of tactile exploration, if you like, task, or tactile servoing task. So for these tasks to be possible, for the robot to be able to do this, it needs to know an accurate estimation of the local pose of the surface or edge relative to the tactile sensor. So once you've got that, you can then control the robot to do this kind of thing, this kind of, if you like, servoing over the surface. Okay, so this relies on accurately estimating the pose of the local object feature. For example, a 3D surface, that's 3 pose components. Imagine a plane, then you've got the depth, roll and pitch of the sensor relative to that surface. That's what you would need to estimate. For a 3D edge, it's 5 pose components. You've got the depth, the position normal to crosswise the edge, and then the roll, pitch, yaw. And as I say, once you've estimated that reliably, then you can use that information to control the tactile sensor to interact with the object, which I'll discuss later how to do that. So this turns out to be quite hard, which is why, there's not a lot of work that have done this. There are other ways of doing it, like the way that, say, Robert Hashke and Chan Li did it. There's related techniques, but in this case, we have if you like, a soft biometric tactile sensor. And so in other cases, like tactile servo, they generally had rigid planar sensors. But the issue is if you've got a soft sensor, then it deforms as it moves, as it interacts with the surface from the frictional shear forces. And if you've got a sensor that works by basically detecting shear, that, if you like, corrupts the information that's in the tactile image about the pose. So, furthermore, it means that the deformation is both history and contact dependent. So as well as the pose information that's encoded in the tactile image, you've got the history of the interaction, the recent history of the interaction with the object as the sensor sheared over it, its motion history. So it's a challenging problem to separate the pose of the surface feature from the deformation due to interaction with the surface. And the way we solved it was using basically deep learning, Bayesian optimization, the hyperparameters, and an appropriate training regime to get that to work. Okay, so what we did is we trained the regime. We used flat objects, such as, say, a flat plane or straight edge. It's sort of the demonstration I did earlier was with curved objects, but it's still, the model still works for estimating pose accurately. So you can train it on the flat plane and straight edge. And then we physically introduced a random unlabeled shear perturbation in the sensor motion just before as it contacts the object. So we're sampling the pose, if you like, the labeled tactile images for different poses under random shear perturbations of that. And then we typically use, say, 2,000 training, 2,000 validation samples, so about 4,000 samples. So the model, which we call a pose knot, standard CNN architecture with binarized tactile images, so black and white tactile images, so all that shading you saw earlier goes away, just black and white. Supervised deep learning use early stopping with a validation loss, and this validation loss is useful for reasons that I'll come to. I say the key trick is to introduce the random unlabeled shear perturbations in the motion of the sensor as you're collecting data. So this is a bit like data augmentation, but this is physically with the robot rather than, if you like, simulated on the data. Then we used now another challenge was that when you do that, it turns out the pose nets are very dependent upon the hyperparameters, much more so than you would normally get in kind of deep learning problems. So the way we got around that is we used a Bayesian optimizer on the hyperparameters to optimize the validation loss. And so this is an example of like 300 trials where you see the validation loss gradually comes down. It takes about a day to do that. Altogether about 15 minutes per training run, and then that kind of hones in on the right hyperparameters like the network architecture. You know, it likes deep networks with wide networks, shallow, you know, kind of hidden dense layers at the end. You know, it kind of hones in on that, tunes it, and then we get sort of very high accuracies on these stimuli. So for a flat surface, we're at like 0.1 millimeter accuracy on the separate test set that we also gather, and like a sort of sub-degree accuracy for the roll and pitch. And then the straight edge, you know, we're at sub-millimeter for like the positions, and you know, about a degree, a few degrees for the orientation on the edge. I should emphasize, this is taken on test data, which is subject to these same random perturbations of shear on the sensor. And actually, the motion of the skin due to shear is a larger effect than the change in the skin due to the different poses. So if you like, you're having to subtract out the more dominant contribution in order to estimate pose. But the story is that it works well. And that is what enables us to do the kind of tactile servoing I was showing before. Okay, so I'll move on to some more tactile servo control now. Again, this relates to Chanley and Robert Hashke. You know, they had with Helge Ritter, they had leading work on this about 2013 and onwards, based on earlier work about 2001 by Chan, I think it was. But you know, our approach here is slightly different from theirs, that they use, if you like, features from the tactile image, whereas we're directly using the pose inferred using the neural network, and then controlling that with PI control in this case. So you have something like a reference pose in the, if you like, the frame of the object feature, which here can be, say, a surface or an edge. That reference pose is compared with the output, the predicted sensor pose from the pose net, to get a pose error, an SE3 pose error. And then, so that's, if you like, that's the reference in the frame of the sensor, that pose. Then that is fed into the PI controller to minimize that error, transformed to the base frame of the robot. Then you've got an appropriate command for the robot to move. That tells the robot how to move, and then, you know, the loop continues with a tactile image that then repeats that to control the robot. The subtleties here is that the object feature, you have to define the object feature in advance. So you have to say either it's a surface or an edge that I'm following, and that determines, first of all, the number of components that you're inferring from the pose net. So for a surface, it would be the ones in red here. That would be the depth, the roll, and the pitch. But then you can use the other components of the pose in the reference. Well, so those components of pose in the reference, they basically give your orientation relative to the surface. So if you set them, if the reference to be orthogonal to the surface, it will make that's what the controller will do. But the other components of the pose, you can set in the reference to then move the robot over the surface. So they allow it to either, you know, move along the surface or along the edge. So it kind of brings those two aspects of the control together. So here's an example. So this is actually with a more accurate pose net now. So if you noticed, the one before had a bit of wobble when it was doing the 3D edge. This is now rock steady because it's basically because it's your error is much smaller, and as you see now, it's like working its way around this saddle. I didn't notice when we were doing experiments, a bit of dust had got into our sensor, which is this thing here. Luckily the neural network was robust to this kind of this kind of defect. And then here you see basically the PID controller working. It's got an integration term here that I'm not quite sure what's going on, but you can see basically the errors are very small because this is accurately tracing the surface. How long have I got left? Got 5 minutes left, I think. Okay, so this is doing the servo control on the ball now. It's basically to show the accuracy here. So this one, so part of the reference here makes the sensor rotate as well it translates. So this, which gives it this kind of rotating motion. Now the accuracy here is that there's nothing to constrain this trajectory to close, but because it's at kind of sub-millimeter and sub-degree accuracy, you find that these trajectories just naturally close because it's a regular ball and the pose estimation is very accurate. And as I say, this all relies upon having the shear being that the neural network is insensitive to the shear deformation. If you don't train that in, this won't work. It's the key feature of this method to work. And somehow, you know, when we do this, we must be doing that too. Because if you've got a soft, deformable tactile sensor, the shear deformation from moving over the surface is the dominant contribution to the tactile sensation. Okay, and then you know, this is basically to show. I mean, basically the method works. You know, and this is now on a load of different objects, 2D objects, kind of accurately going around these complex shapes. You know, 3D objects. This is a complex head. That, you know, so I mean, in essence, I mean, as I say, you know, the method works. And is reliable across different objects, different kind of surface textures of the objects. And I emphasize that in all cases, for the edges, this was trained on a flat edge, a straight edge. And for the surface, it was trained on a plane, a flat plane. But then, you know, probably because of the regularization from these shear deformations, it's very robust to the shape of the surface. We don't need to train it over like complex curved surfaces. It just basically works. Okay, so I say hopefully some papers will be coming out soon on the first part and the last part of this. Still working their way through review, so keep an eye out for that if you're interested in this. And then the other one is published in special issue. Just to draw out, there's a couple of papers that I've been involved with at ICRA 2020. Sim-to-real transfer, optical tactile sensing, that's on Monday by Ed Johns and Zihan Ding. And I basically, at Imperial College, I gave them a sensor and they did this very nice work. It's basically how you would learn these type of pose models without having, in simulation, but not you know, if you like, sampling from the environment. And then we've got another paper, Ben Ward-Cherrier, who works with me in our group, on neuromorphic optical tactile sensing. So this is using an event-based sensor inside an event-based camera inside the optical tactile sensor. Yeah, so then you have an event-based neuromorphic tactile sensor. So if you're interested in that, Ben's presenting on that. That's our group who I want to say thanks to, and our funders. I guess I'm done.